Tell us a bit about your early experiences in the Mission District, Chuy, your first.
Well, for me, some of my first experiences going out to the mission were with my homies. You know, we grew up in Martinez, and really for us, we grew up in the 70s and late 60s cruising. And for us, we were lowriders. And, you know, all of a sudden the car really kind of became our way out. And we first began, you know, lowriding over in Richmond around 23rd Street, where there was a really active main. And then we heard there was a big main over at 24th and Mission, so we went out there. And it was, I'll tell you, a great time because, you know, the music was really a lot of the things that fueled us. Santana, you know, then into the 70s, Malo. And then people, you know, would tell us about other bands that were happening and other events. But there was also a lot of stuff that was going on in the mission that was really important to our growing up that had to do with politics, and particularly what we call the Chicano movement. You know, events that were going on around Cesar Chavez, around particularly some of the events that were happening around the Nicaraguan Revolution. So for us, it expanded our viewpoint of the world, but also expanded our musical horizons, just really being lowriders, getting out of the city that we were from and really getting into a new environment. And the mission at the time was going through an incredible cultural renaissance. You know, the Mission Cultural Center was getting founded. There were artists that were starting to get into the mural movement. There were a lot of activism in the colleges, and there was drumming in the parks. And I think that that in itself really gave us a foundation for something that I didn't realize later would really serve as a guide for our lives.
In the recent interview that Pete Escovedo did with the San Francisco Chronicle, he talked about the brown sound. Were you aware of the brown sound emerging? Because you said in the book you were talking about the cultural pride of Marlow. Were you aware of that happening at the time? Can you tell us a bit about that, Pete?
I was aware of the brown sound based on people that were older than me that brought that music to us. In my neighborhood, one of my neighbors went to UC Berkeley. And he was a Chicano, coming from a large family. And he was the one that began to turn us on to the Santana albums, the Malo albums, and would tell us about events that were going on in concerts. You know, and so as a result, we would wind up going to Winterland, and he would take us there. He was kind of our big brother, if you will, into the scene. But for us, as far as the brown sound, I mean, I think we had all been aware of it based on Richie Valens. That Richie was really one of the first that we saw that we could relate to, that all of a sudden we saw someone like us, you know, a Mexican-American doing a music that really had a lot of depth to it, you know, La Bamba, if you will, Come On, Let's Go. Those are very important things. For me, I had also been, you know, an immigrant. So the thing is that I had wound up going from, you know, a kid picking cotton in Texas, you know, after coming from Mexico, and then going to East LA. You know, when my father decided that that was going to be the path for a better life. And in East LA, I was there in the early 1960s where I heard the music of Cannibal and the Headhunters and the Blandells and bands like that. And then, you know, we wound up moving to Long Beach. And in Long Beach, the Watts riots hit. And it was during that time when the Watts riots hit that we were, you know, taken into a situation where we had to be bused to integrate the schools. So we became very aware of black culture. And then my dad passed away, and we wound up moving up to Martinez around 67, 68. And just at the time when everybody was, you know, starting to get into the hippie movement, growing their hair long and smoking weed, doing all that. But it was an incredible time. It really was a cultural renaissance. And one that, man, I tell you, I never regret that I grew up during that time because, you know, there was so much openness. And I think that really in the whole hippie lexicon, it was the whole idea of peace and love that really has stood with me, you know, to this day.
Can you tell us a bit about your early exposure to the Santana band, what that meant to you, and how that suddenly made, you know, suddenly Latin music, if you want to put it in a generic terms, on everybody's record player in a very crossover, in a big crossover way. Can you tell us what that meant to you?
Sure. Santana really meant a lot for me because at the time I had been a guitar player. I started playing guitar when I was 10 years old. My uncle taught me how to play guitar. He was a bass player and a guitarist who played in the hotels in Ciudad Juarez, and they used to do covers of English rock and roll tunes in Spanish. And so he had taught me music. And so then when I wound up in Martinez, I started playing in a band, Los Hermanos Jaime. And so we did basically Mexican music, rancheras, and a sound that was coming in known as the grupos, which was more of an electric sound with keyboards, with electric guitars. And then I started hearing the Santana sound. And man, I wore out a couple of copies of the Santana 45, man, of Evil Ways trying to learn the song, And then I got a gig with a band called Los Deleites. And this was I was around 16. I was a sophomore in high school. And we started playing at a place in Oakland called the Apple Hall. And it was at the Apple Hall where we started playing these songs. So, and the people wanted to hear that. And so instead of everybody just dancing polkas or dancing, slow dances cheek to cheek that were from the grupo sound, they started dancing more on the rock side. And so we kind of got popular because we were able to do that. And that, I learned the licks from Carlos, note for note. And that became something that was really, really important. And, pretty much I think that what Carlos did was that he created a wave of guitarists who were like me, that learned those records note for note. We in turn, played them at the Mexican dances, and people got turned on to that sound. And as a result, it grew. And I thought that that was something that was really important. And of course, as Malo came in, we had to learn those songs as well. But for me, really, as I grew into the music, I started getting a little bit more into jazz. And it was when I saw Azteca for the first time in 1973, when I was a senior in high school at Winterland, that I realized that jazz and Latin rock had an incredible connection. And that band made an incredible impact. To this day, I am a devout fan of Pete Escovedo and the Escovedo Brothers Band and what Coke did and what they did in Oakland, really, bringing a very strong black tradition in Oakland, from the funk, to the jazz and the blues, and reflecting it in the Azteca band.
It was interesting for me, but I'll reflect it back to you. The fact, a song like just going back to the Santana thing briefly, a song like Guajira, which is based almost like on a Cuban dance, a Guajira, that was on an album which was very electric, surrounded by a lot of electricity. Did those sort of things back then, do you think that what kind of cultural significance do you think that they had in introducing people to more, what I would call more kind of traditional forms of Latin music? Whereas the Santana was very psychedelicized, had loads of disparate elements, but a song like Guajira, for example, it wasn't totally authentic, but it had a more authentic hillside kind of feel to it. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I think that one of the things that songs that Carlos introduced, like Guajira, Para los Rumberos, actually didn't take us back to traditional forms, but what it told us was that there were people on the other side of this country that were like us. And we began to discover, in particular, Puerto Rican musicians, New Yorkers, if you will, like Willie Bobo, like Tito Puente, people who were bilingual, who were bicultural, and who also had a political sense, who were also fighting for, civil rights in their own way. For me, I was very blessed to be able to see the rise of the Black Panthers and the Black Beret and the Brown Berets. And I say that because they were people that stood up for our community at a time when our community came under attack, particularly at the hands of the police, immigration service and all. And we saw the same thing happening in New York with the Young Lords. And that this music that was coming out of New York was also coming out of the barrios. It was barrio music. And I think that really when you look at the way that our communities are, we are really a people that were in flux, being bilingual, being bicultural, and being told from one side and the other side that was not the way to be. But yet we fought for that identity because that was who we were. And, we talked in Spanglish, Órale vato, what are you doing, ese, that kind of thing. Because that's who we were. And when we heard a guy like Joe Batan singing Brown Eyed Soul, like the way Little Willie G did, like the way all these other guys did from East LA, there was a commonality, man, that made us fall in love, that made us realize that there were no borders between all of us, as Latinos. That's when I began to realize that there was a bigger picture in this country than just being a Chicano or a Mexican American, that we did have a commonality with other folks that were not necessarily Mexican that united us as Latinos.
Actually, one of the songs of Voices are going to start with Carlos Rivera's tonight. Can you give us a bit of, so maybe we can cut back, give us a bit of your feelings about Carlos Rivera's Tito to Santana?
Well, for me, when I went and saw Azteca at Winterland in '73, this was a bill that included Malo, Tito Puente, and Azteca. And Tito Puente was somebody that had been very close to Bill Graham. Bill Graham had been a waiter in the Catskill Mountains. And when he was a waiter in the Catskill Mountains, this was where a lot of the Jewish folks in New York would go to the resorts to basically, vacation, to enjoy themselves. And Tito would play out there. And what's his name? Bill Graham was a great mambo dancer. People don't know this. If you see the movie Bugsy, you'll see Bill Graham dancing to the Mambo Inn. And when he was there, he told Tito, man, someday I'm going to present you. Someday I'm going to bring you and put you in concert. And Tito looked at this young guy and said, yeah, sure. And this was the promise kept by Bill Graham. And Para los Rumberos was this great song that Tito wrote that was, for the rumberos, for the dancers. Because Tito was one of those people that had come out of the Palladium Ballroom during the Mambo era where you had to please the dancers. If you didn't please the dancers, and it was a very competitive time for these orchestras. And I think that what Tito brought was really this incredible explosion of percussion that, unified people. And Tito was a tremendous influence on Jose Chepito Areas. Chepito, los Atiletes de Nicaragua, had come from a great, strong tradition in Nicaragua of Cuban music and of the sound that Tito and those guys in New York were doing. And he was one of the guys that brought that music to Carlos Santana. And Bill Graham, being their manager, applauded that and really helped them cultivate it. So as a result, we saw, once again, the meeting of these two coasts coming together because people had open ears and open minds. And something that really stands to this day, because here in San Francisco, we've got a tremendously strong salsa scene still. And I'll tell you, it all goes back to people that believed in this music and loved to dance.
Can you, Chuy, just to finish off now, can you give us some feelings or some predictions about the future of Latin music in the next 10, 20 maybe?
Sure.
Give us some ideas of how you see it going, Chuy, the evolution of Latin music in this country.
I really do believe that the future of Latin music in this country is going to be stronger. Part of it has to do with the fact that, excuse me, I really do believe that the evolution of Latin music is the future. Part of it is because of the growth of the populations. Right now, we are seeing, literally the Latino community becoming the minority, if you will, in the U.S. And part of the thing that's happening with a whole bunch of these kids is that much like we grew up with this bilingual biculturalism, they're coming into it the same way. But they are being impacted differently because they are being impacted by hip-hop. They are going back and finding some of this Latin rock music. They're also being incredibly impacted by electronics. They are now composing on the computers and they are creating a variety of sounds. But part of the thing that I really love is that they also are still maintaining the tradition of the dance. They're still getting together and congregating and dancing and, creating just wonderful feeling in the clubs. And I think that as long as we're able to find a place where we can all congregate and enjoy the music in a communal way, in a social way, that people will find their own relative expressions. It isn't like the way Mexican music was in the past where it was very regionalized. Now, we're seeing kids that are coming up in the Los Lobos vein. We're seeing kids that are coming up and going back to the Santana days. We're seeing kids that are coming up and being hip-hoppers. And we're seeing the kids that are now looking at the new elements like reggaeton, as well as some of the other elements that are happening around the world and creating their own sound. I think that really the future belongs to everybody that really appreciates good music. And I think that honestly, Jim, that borders are breaking down, where I do predict that like in the next 10 years, you will see music that has so many flavors And it's not called Latin music. It's just called music.